Hello everyone and welcome to my long-awaited AP itemization guide. AP itemization in League is super complicated and also has a lot of traps kind of left in it where if you make some small mistake in your itemization, it can end up really hurting you. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go through and explain AP itemization from the very beginning and also answer a bunch of the questions that I get asked in Twitch chat all the time. So feel free to skip around in the sections. I'm going to kind of go through the list and just explain a whole bunch of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking in a very broad sense about what the standard build is for AP champs. Not so much the items specifically, but the order in which you buy them. Now, obviously, this can depend a little bit on what champ you're playing, but you'll kind of see that for most AP champs, they generally follow this rule. You don't have to worry too much about the why for now. That'll just become clear, I think, as I talk through all the items. But for now, just trust me on it. So pretty much for the start of like any AP build, you generally have your core item and boots. So this could be like a chapter item for mages, it could be like a Lichbane or, Rocket Belt or whatever for assassins. And yeah, you're going to get that and your boots alongside each other. Then your second item and your last item are your true situational slots. So these are item slots where you can basically buy whatever you need for the game. Now, it will only be your second and last item, generally. Now, for what items you can buy, there's a whole bunch of them here, and I will go into detail for them later. But for now, just know that your second item and your last item are situational. Your third and fourth items are, in 99% of cases, going to be Rabadons and Cryptbloom, depending on which order you need them in. Again, I'm going to talk about, why that is and which order to buy them in later. But just bear with me. You're going to go, again, first core item and boots, situational second item, Rabadons and Cryptbloom, or Cryptbloom and Rabadons, and then again, another situational first item. Almost every single champ in the game follows this, and it will become clear as I go through all this as to why. So I'm going to start off with early game itemization. So early game itemization actually is pretty straightforward. There's only a few things you really need to know. First, very basic things is, are you going to start D-Shield or Doran's Ring? Most AP champs will prefer D-Ring, but if you're playing a melee into range, something like a Kali versus any range matchup, you would start Doran's Shield, but there aren't really any range champs that would start that. So for the most part, you can just start Doran's Rings and 2 potions. Now, the next 3 items are very important for the early game, and when I'm coaching people, I see these definitely under ball. So the first one is refillable. This is an item that should be bought almost every single game. The thing is, refillable gives you effectively 200 health per base for only 150 gold, which is an insane amount of efficiency. I mean, if you look at Ruby Crystal is 150 health, right? So even less than refillable for 400 gold. So that is like, you can get this health for much cheaper than buying a Ruby. And it's very easy to just sell your refillable later on in the game, either to open up an item slot or just to complete an item. So obviously, you don't want to buy something like a refillable over a big component, which we'll talk about, something like Chapter. But honestly, there actually are some lanes where you might want to do that, like heavy poke lanes. But just generally, refillable should be one of your highest priority early game items and something you're going to want to buy in almost every lane. Now, a lot of the time I get asked, like, should I buy a refillable if I'm winning or if I'm not taking poke or I don't need to? And the answer is, like, pretty much always yes. So obviously, refillable is really good for poke matchups, right? If you're taking a lot of damage, having more health is great. The thing is, though, like, even in all-in matchups, it's quite good, right? Because you get to stay healthier. And you got to realize that health isn't only used defensively. You can use health aggressively, right? Like, if you have a refillable and your opponent does not, even if you win trades, that allows you to take one, like, really dumb trade. It allows you to take one extra turret shot. It allows you to just play more aggressively, knowing that, like, well, you have 200 more health. If you guys just fight to the death, like, he hits 0 before you do, right? So you can use that health in order to play more aggressively, in order to enable all-ins. And honestly, just as a cushion, like, even really good players make mistakes, right? So having a little bit of extra health is nice. A very OP item, definitely be thinking about that one. The next is boots. So boots are also a really good item, both tier 1s and tier 2s. I'll talk about tier 2s in a bit. But tier 1 boots are super effective, mainly because movement speed is an OP stat. So movement speed, super nice for dodging skill shots. Also super nice for kiting out melees. Like, if you're being chased down the lane, then having more movement speed than your opponent is really nice. Especially because, like, most AP, especially mage champs, tend to have less move speed than the melees they're up against. So kind of bridging that gap with extra boots movement speed is really nice. Now, sometimes boots can be a bit of a bait. If it's a matchup where it's more about wave clear wars as opposed to, like, direct interaction. An example could be if you're playing, like, Hui versus, I don't know, what's another wave clear champ? Maybe Hui versus Talia. Like, in that sort of game, maybe boots are lower priority. They're not going to be bad because boots still help with getting away from ganks. They still help with, like, skirmishing and roaming. But you might want to get mana before you go boots, right? Like, let's say we had only the choice between, I don't know, tier and boots, I think we would go for tier, right? Because the matchup is more about a mana check than it is like a movement speed. So these items obviously very, very useful. Now the next one is one of the most important things you need to understand for mid lane. Dark Seal is probably the best AP item in the entire game. You can go on the wiki and read this if you want, but Dark Seal is kind of misunderstood. It's actually gold efficient on 0 stacks. So basically what that means is you can buy Dark Seal on the off chance that you get stacks. Even if you don't, it's still a good item. If you do get stacks, it's hyper efficient. Now, Mejais is nowhere near as good as Dark Seal, and I will talk about Mejais later, but basically, you should be buying Dark Seal every game. It doesn't necessarily have to be first base, doesn't even necessarily have to be second base. But if you can buy it early, you probably should, and if you get stacks on it, it's insane. And it's particularly good on champs that are hard to kill or have lots of AoE. You know, if you think of a champ like Ahri, very easy to get a lot of stacks because you won't die, and you're almost always going to tag everyone in a team fight. But again, like I said, because this item is gold efficient, even on 0 stacks, it is still going to be useful for you. You know, even if you're a champ that dies a lot, if you happen to get high Dark Seal stacks, it's going to be very effective, especially when combined later on with Death Cap. Now, one quick thing I will say is that a lot of people will say gold efficiency is fake, and that is somewhat true. There are stats in this game that aren't going to be that valuable. Like, for example, would you buy Lost Chapter on Akali just because it's gold efficient? Like, of course not, right? Because the mana is a wasted stat. The thing with Dark Seal, though, is it's all stats that you need. All the efficiency comes from getting extra AP, which, if you're playing an AP champ, you're never going to say no to that. So Dark Seal is extremely broken. Please buy that every game. And these 3 items here, in general, you should just buy these first base if you can. Like, almost always, my first base is a mid is either, like, tier Dark Seal refillable, if I'm going Seraphs, or, like, Boots Dark Seal refillable. Almost always. Now, the next items that we have here is somewhat situational. I'll talk about tier first. So tier is basically you just buy this early if you are going for Seraphs. I will talk about, again, which chapter items are best down here. But yeah, tier, it actually isn't too bad of a component, and I would say that tier is, like, better than Amtome a lot of the time. That being said, you know, one thing I do get asked is, like, if you are going Seraphs, do you have to buy tier first base? And the answer is, like, you should, but you don't have to. You know, if you had, like, a really big spike or you really need early game items, you can delay tier until second base, but I generally wouldn't delay it longer than that. Next is Chapter. So Chapter is normally, like, the best AP item and one that I get asked about a lot. I'm not going to talk about all the other things like Aether-Wisp and Amtomes and Alternator because most of them are fairly straightforward because most of those champs don't use mana. But for chapter champs, you kind of have to weigh something up. You have to weigh up, like, do I want this chapter spike that is very expensive, but essentially gives me unlimited mana at the cost of potentially giving up all my movement speed, all my sustain, and all my potential to get Dark Seals. So generally, like, if you can buy a full chapter, normally you should. But honestly, like, okay, if you can buy only chapter and nothing else, sometimes it can be not worth it. Like, it might be better to buy, like, you know, Dark Seal, Boots, refillable Sapphire Crystal, or something like that, you know, over a Lost Chapter. And that's just because all the components can actually go further than a Lost Chapter. But, of course, it's a little matchup dependent, right? Again, if we kind of come back and say, if it's one of those matchups where it's all about wave clearing and just spamming, then Chapter is, like, the best thing you can do for that. Or if you're super far ahead and all you want to do is bully more, again, Chapter unlocks the ability to do that, which is super, super nice. Now, one other thing you can do, if you do base on this, like, significant amount of gold, is actually rush tier 2 boots. So I'll talk about, like, which boots to buy later, but just know that you can buy something like Sork Shoes refillable, and that's especially useful in skill shot heavy matchups. If you're playing something like Syndra versus Orianna or Orianna versus Syndra, you know, having those having that extra movement speed is super nice because, like, you're playing this heavy skill shot matchup where it's more about, well, just can I dodge these as opposed to am I tanking it or am I, you know, having a mana check or anything. It is really just about having more movement speed. Tier 2 boots rush, again, extremely good in assassin matchups. Can be good sometimes just for the early spike as well, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. Finally, we have some defensive items for the early game. So we have Null Magic, Ruby, and Cloth Armor. So of the three, Ruby is... Wait, where'd it go? Of the three, Ruby is kind of the... What is going on here? Let me start again. Of the three, Ruby is kind of the worst. So the thing is that Ruby is just less effective HP than refillable. Now, the reason I put this in here is because if you're playing some sort of assassin matchup, right? And you plan on building a health item later instead of a defensive item. Like, let's say you're playing something like Cassiopeia, right? Let's just say, for whatever reason, you don't want to build Rod of Ages. You want your build to be like Seraphs, Liandry, Rylai. If you're in an assassin matchup and you weren't building Roa, something you could do for early game stats in order to help survive the assassin matchup would be to buy a Ruby Crystal, because it's going to build into a health item that you're building later, and having those extra stats makes it a lot harder for the assassin to snowball. Now, the reason I put this on here, despite it kind of being the worst option, is just because, again, there are some build paths where you don't want to build a defensive or whatever, so you can go Ruby instead. But like I said, it's generally just less effective because the resistances tend to give more effective HP, and like you can get more HP with refillable anyway. So I very rarely do that, maybe 1 in 100 games or something, but something you can think about. But okay, these ones here, so Null Magic and Cloth Armor. So a lot of the time as a mid, you might need Magic Resist against someone who's rushed flat Magic Pen. So like, if you're playing against an assassin matchup or a burst champ, let's say you're playing against a Fizz, it can be really nice to have a null magic. But the thing is, null magic often doesn't build into anything you want early. So let's say you're playing against Fizz and you want to build a Banshees later. Well, we can't really build a Banshees before our first mana item. But we also don't want to play against an assassin for 15 minutes having no magic resist whatsoever. So it's like, okay, we could upgrade to Mercs, but generally you only upgrade to Mercs if you need the tenacity, because you don't actually gain any more MR from upgrading to Mercs. So in that situation, if we're versus an assassin and we want to build, some defensive, but we don't want to build, Mercs, or we don't want to build steel caps, then what we can do is we can just buy a null magic or a cloth armor, assuming that we're going to build, something out of it later. We could either build a Zhonya second, or we could build a Banshee second. So again, this is very, very good against assassins. And the reason is that resistances counter flat penetration. So this is something that I get asked about all the time, is why don't you buy Sork Shoes when the enemy team buys magic resist? And the main reason for that is because, think of it like this. If your opponent has, say, 40 magic resist, then reducing it by 18 magic pen is a lot, right? That's almost halving it. If your opponent has 100 magic resist, then reducing it by 18 is very little. So magic resist counters flat pen, because magic resist just, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Like 1 MR counters 1 flat magic pen, but it's much easier to acquire magic resist than it is to buy pen. And pen, again, is more valuable when your targets have low MR. So you buy Sorks, and I guess I should save that for the Sork section, but you'll be buying Sorks against targets that are squishy and have low resists. But if you play against an assassin that builds lethality, or in other words, essentially flat AD pen, or if you're playing against a mage or assassin or whatever that's building flat magic pen, then you can go with this resist, and that counters it out really nicely. So now let's talk about boots, and I'll kind of expand on that a bit. So the main boots that you're going to buy as an AP champ are normally these three. We've got Sorks, CDR boots, and Merc treads. So the main question we're first going to ask ourselves is how many APs are on a team? Or in other words, how likely are my opponents to build magic resist? Because it might not just be because of APs. It can also be because of CC. If you play with a champ like Leona on your team, very, very good chance that the enemy team builds Mercs, because tenacity is very, very useful against Leona. But it's just a byproduct that they happen to have 25 magic resist. And Sork Shoes are very bad against targets with flat magic resist. So just to reiterate this, in case you didn't watch the previous section, flat magic pen is countered by magic resist, because if you buy 18 magic pen, your opponent spends 450 gold on buying 25 MR, your magic pen is already completely cancelled out. So percent magic pen, like Cryptbloom or Void Staff, is much better against high MR values, whereas Sork Shoes with the flat magic pen is much better against low MR values. So if you're playing against a bunch of squishies with no MR and they all have like 45 magic resist, then having the combination of, say, Sork Shoes Shadow Flame is you're almost gonna deal true damage, right? If you're playing against Cassante that has 150 magic resist, then he doesn't give a fuck about your magic pen. It's gonna be pointless until you have that percent magic pen. So the TLDR is, like, if you're expecting your opponents to build magic resist, or you have multiple APs on your team, probably don't go Sork Shoes. That being said, Sork Shoes are probably the best early spike you can buy, and sometimes it's even worth buying Sorks early, even if you expect them to buy MR later, just because of this sheer strength of the spike you'll get in the moment, right? So, like, let's say that you're not expecting MR to come until 3 items, you can buy Sorks, stay on your first base just for the huge spike, and kind of ride that power out until later on you can buy a Crypto. Now, CR boots are generally just the boot that you buy if either you base on awkward gold and you don't have enough gold to buy Sorks, or if you think Sorks are not valuable because they have too much mana resist, right? So in my opinion, it is just like if you have multiple APs on your team, or expecting to buy you're expecting them to buy magic resist, instead of Sorks, just go CDR boots. Next one is Mercs. So as I talked about in the previous section, Mercs are valuable for the combination of all these three stats of tenacity, move speed, plus MR. So this is very, very useful in games where they have APCCs. So an example would be if you're playing against Syndra, or Zoe, or Lissandra, or LeBlanc. All these champs have AP and CC, and all of them have skill shots as well, where the movement speed is very, very valuable. Now, if you don't need the tenacity, you're better off not upgrading Mercs. So let's say that you're playing against something like, what's a champ that doesn't have CC? They all have CC these days. Okay, let's say you're playing against Orianna mid and Karthus jungle, right? Clearly, we want magic resist because they're double AP mid jungle. So what you would want to do in that case is you would buy a null magic mantle early and you would go Banshee second. You wouldn't upgrade it to Merc Treads because the tenacity doesn't do anything for you. So that's kind of like you're rushing Mercs again when the combination of the stats is valuable. So I listed some specific examples there, but there are other champs in the game where you can think about that against Leona, potentially against Ashe, Sejuani, Lilia. Like there's lots of champs that have APCC and they might not always be in mid. Now, one thing to quickly say about this is that Mercs are a neutralizer. They help you lose less. So a lot of the time, if you want to snowball, it might not be worth buying them. I'll give you an example. Let's say that the enemy team has like jungle, Sejuani, support, Leona, AD carry, Ashe, right? Great Merc Treads game. But if you're playing against Lucian mid, the Merc Treads don't help you against Lucian mid at all. In fact, like all you're going to do is put yourself in a hole. Right, so you would definitely not want to buy Mercs until later, until after the laning phase, after you're interacting with more than just Lucian. Now, there is an argument because you might get ganked by jungle support, maybe you need them, but I would try and get away with not buying them. Also, and I guess coming back to like the snowballing thing, if you're playing, let's say you're, I don't know, you're playing against some champ that you normally buy Mercs against, let's say Syndra, but on your first base, you're really far ahead. Let's say you're 2-0. You could buy Mercs, and they're still going to be valuable, right? You can still play aggressively with move speed and MR, but it might be better to buy like a chapter and tier 1 boots and upgrade to Mercs later because you really want a hard pressure right now. So, again, TLDR, Sorks for solo AP, CDR if you're not solo AP, and Merc Treads if you need the tenacity. Now, the other three boots are not often bought. Steel caps are not very good on most ranged mids. They can be good on melee APs, but the reason they're not good on ranged is because, again, for similar reason that you don't upgrade Mercs for AMR, you don't really upgrade steel caps for armor either because you can go Zhonya's instead and it's just more efficient. You're only really going steel caps if you actually get this like reduces incoming damage from attacks. But the thing is, like, as a ranged champ, you're not often just sitting there getting autoed. That's more for like tanks and frontliners. So just generally steel caps kind of suck on ranged AP. Again, you could maybe buy a melee AP, but I think you're mostly better off buying Zhonya's unless you're playing a tank. Swifties, I buy this extremely rarely. Swifties are good against Rylai's users, and against like some certain champs like Brand, where they just like constantly slow you, or maybe like Zillion or something. But honestly, I buy these very, very rarely, so yeah, you probably don't need to worry about it too much. I think, yeah. And I guess the last one here, the Symbiotic Souls. So this is really only for a few champs like Talon. I think maybe Akshan builds this sometimes, just for champs that are going to roam a whole lot and just like want really high uptime on the map. Personally, I don't really play any champs that use these, but there are some kind of like roaming champs, I guess, that might use them. But I think most of the time you're better off just using Sorks. I think it's more for like AD roaming champs that obviously don't have like lethality boots or something when they don't need a defensive boot. So we won't worry too much about that. Our next section is all about situational items. So this is going to be for your second item slot and your last items. So the first situational item that you can buy is Shattered Flame. This is kind of like your default if you're solo AP and you're not expecting to build any magic resist. If you're still unsure about why Magic Pen is bad against magic resist, go and watch the boot section. I explained it in detail with Merc Treads. But basically, if you're expecting the enemy to build magic resist, you should not build Shattered Flame because the flat Magic Pen is going to easily get cancelled out. That being said, on pretty much all mids, this is a really good second item if you're solo AP and really just not expecting to build any magic resist at all. Another really solid option is Horizon. So if you're not really sure what to buy second, Horizon is often the best choice. The thing with Horizon is it's got pretty good stats and it's very cheap, and also Hypershot is actually quite easy to trigger now for lots of different champs. So Horizon is just kind of like the, if you're not sure what to buy, your default go-to item. You know, if none of these other situational items call out to you, then you just go for Horizon. Liandry is really good against health stacker teams, especially if you're playing a champ that has either good AoE or some dots. This is particularly good in the current meta because all the supports rush Warmogs, which means that when you're team fighting against them, you're going to be getting insane value out of this. Also, just in general, champs have a lot of health these days after, you know, durability patches, and also like bruiser items have a lot of health on them. In the jungle, a lot of the AP junglers build Liandry, so there's just a lot of health in general. And I think that even though Horizon is probably like, again, your default if you don't know what to go, a lot of the time Liandry is just going to be actually the better item just because there is so much health in the game. So really be thinking about these two here as kind of your situational second items if you're not still AP. Next, we have Zhonya's and Banshees. So if the enemy team is really heavy on one damage type, it's a really easy game to go for Banshees or Zhonya. So like if they're all AD or if they have like triple AP or something, that's a really, really good game to be buying one of these. Another good time to buy it is if there's unavoidable damage. So the thing with buying these is it's definitely, you're doing less damage than if you build one of these items here, right? But if you're against like somewhat unavoidable damage, it can be really good to buy it. So an example would be if you play against something like Vi, right? It's basically unavoidable. Or if you play against something like Zed or Karthus, those can all be good games to buy these defensive items because it's not realistic to avoid the damage. Now, that is kind of a hard thing to judge because sometimes you can be like, well, I'm not sure if I can avoid all this damage. Maybe I should put a defensive, maybe I shouldn't. I think in general, then it's good to push your limits and try build something more aggressive, and you might find that you can solve kind of like your issue of taking damage just through better positioning. But again, the main times being if you're against like an assassin whose damage you have a difficult time avoiding, or if they're really heavy on one damage type, then you can itemize a defensive item second. So these are, again, are your main 5 items that you're going to be buying, but there are some other situational items here. So the first one I'll talk about is Storm Surge. This item sucks. It's just terrible. So this item is getting buffed next patch. I'm pretty sure it still sucks. The thing is, it's like a flat magic pen option, but it's just worse than Shadow Flame. It sometimes has some uses being built ultra late game, which I'll talk about later when you sell your boots. But generally, you just don't buy Storm Surge on anything. Shadow Flame is just a better item with better stats and an easier proc to use. Whereas Storm Surge, you really rely on just being super fed and, you know, being able to actually proc this, which is not often realistic. So I just think this item sucks. I genuinely don't think that any champ in the game should build Storm Surge currently, unless it's like 6th item. Now, Cosmic is also kind of a better late game item. There's not that many champs that use Cosmic second over Horizon at the moment. I guess there's like some utility champs maybe that just like really value having the extra movement speed on top of like a tiny bit more ability haste, but I honestly think that Horizon is just kind of a better version of Cosmic a lot of the time. I guess the nice thing about Cosmic, depending on what champ you are, is it gives some health. But again, a lot of APs just prefer not having health and just, you know, having more damage. So Cosmic, kind of leftover item at the moment, left out. It doesn't get built very often. Rylai's is kind of champ dependent. If you're playing a dot champion like a Cassier, a Brand, or a Malzahar, you kind of like Rylai's. But again, like this isn't really built on anyone except those. It's just for champs that have insane synergy with the item, and likely you already be building it on those champs, you know, as part of your build anyway. So probably not something you need to worry about too much. Nashor's, again, core item on a couple champs, like Azir or maybe Kale. I know like Echo at one point used to build this, but there's really just not that many champs that will build it, and a lot of the ones that do actually build it first item anyway, so yeah, probably not too much worth worrying about. Now, Lichbane actually is one worth thinking about. So the thing with Lichbane is that Lichbane is actually very, very good later in the game. So Lichbane can be a really, really good 5th or last item, basically, because at that point, the AP ratio on Lichbane is giving you a lot of additional damage. I think 2nd item Lichbane, so in place of your Shadow Flame or something, it can be good and it can be kind of bad. Like, it's really good once you complete your death cap. Like, the combination of, let's say you're playing Victor and you go, like, Luden's Lichbane death cap. Lichbane will be stronger than Shadow Flame by the time you complete death cap, but Shadow Flame will be much stronger until you complete death cap. So it's kind of like, you know, which spike do you value higher? I think having the earlier spike is probably better, and I would save Lichbane until later. That being said, with champs with insane synergies with it, such as potentially Azir into squishy comps, or like, you know, Victor in games where Shadow Flame isn't good and Liandry's isn't good, that can be where you think about Lichbane. And Riftmaker is not often bought, mainly because it can't fit into most champs' builds, because again, like, you've got to buy like these Rabadons and your Cryptblooms and stuff. This can be used on like tank champs that don't build that. Like if you're playing tank AP Gallier, where your build is like, I think you go the AP Sunfire, it's called Hollow Radiance. Your Hollow Radiance Liandry Riftmaker, or Hollow Radiance Riftmaker Liandry, like those can be solid builds, but those are different because they're more tank builds than they are actually AP builds. So they don't really have the same rules of like needing to build Rabadons and Cryptbloom. So again, pretty situational, not an item that will be bought that often. The main ones you just want to think about are these 5 here. Your Shadow Flame, Horizon, Liandry, and then your 2 defensive items. Now, on to kind of the biggest point of this video, which is your 3rd and 4th items, Rabadons and Cryptbloom, why they have to be these, and why not buy them earlier. So first off, it's Rabadons. This is like probably it's not the best AP item, that would be Dark Seal, but it's probably the most important. The thing with Death Cap is it not only gives you a huge amount of AP, but it also increases your total AP by 35%. So this is the single biggest damage spike that you can buy. And if you ever have a build without Death Cap, you're going to deal very little damage. And also, the longer you delay Death Cap, you're going to do very little damage. So if possible, you almost always want to buy Death Cap 3rd, right? This would be your ideal build. You go like Ludens and Sork Shoes, Shadow Flame for the flat pen, and then we go at Death Cap. Now, after that, most likely you will need a Cryptbloom. And the reason is that by this point, people tend to start buying Magic Resist. And even if they don't, their flat magic resists do scale up, so people can just, if you click on them and they have like 80 MR, that is starting to be a time to buy Cryptbloom. And you might be wondering, how much MR to make you buy a Cryptbloom. Generally, if people have if several people have 1 MR item, that can even just be Mercs, that is already a Cryptbloom game. Now, this can depend a little bit on what champion you're hitting. For example, if you're playing a Kali, it doesn't make much sense to itemize for killing the Cassante, right? Because that's not your job. But if the enemy AD carry suddenly had a Maw, you would really want a Cryptbloom, right? Or actually, in Akali's case, you'd want a Void, which I'll come to later. But yeah, so basically, the moment your target has Magic Resist, you need to start building % Magic Pen, either Cryptbloom or Void. If you're playing a Mage, generally you have to play front to back, and so you have to hit tanks first, which means if the enemy support or tank top or whatever ends up building Magic Resist, again, you have to go Cryptbloom. So what will often happen is if you get to 3 items, let's say you've bought I don't know, Seraph's, Liandry, and now they have a bunch of Magic Resist, you need to go Cryptbloom 3rd, because it's actually going to deal more damage than Death Cap, and also it's cheaper than Death Cap, which can matter, because once your targets start to have a ton of Magic Resist, it's very hard for you to kill them, which means you can't get more gold other than from farming. And as you get later in the game, it also becomes kind of more difficult to farm. You'd have less time, because people are just starting to ARAM and stuff, especially in lower elo. So if they start to show a lot of MR by the time you're going for your 3rd item, then you should buy Cryptbloom before Death Cap. So go Cryptbloom 3rd, Death Cap 4th. But if you can, you go Death Cap 3rd and then Cryptbloom 4th. Now, if you buy Death Cap 3rd and they still don't have MR by your 4th item, you can buy something else. You could buy another situational item. So you could go, say, Seraph's, Liandry, Death Cap, and then a Shadow Flame maybe, or a Horizon, or whatever you want to buy, whatever you need, basically. And then you can buy Cryptbloom later. Or, if you're very, very lucky, you'll never have to build a Cryptbloom. But this is very unlikely because Magic Resist is very, very OP. So yeah, most of the time it is just going to be Rabadons 3rd and Cryptbloom 4th. Now, why don't you buy them earlier? The answer is you can, sort of, but often you won't. So, okay, why don't we go Death Cap 2nd if it's so good? First reason is build path is really, really expensive. You have to buy 2 1250 gold items. It's quite hard to consistently base with 1250 gold. So let's say you base with 1k gold. What are you going to buy? You can't buy anything. So you just walk out of base with 3 kills worth of gold, which is a really, really bad idea. So you can only really go Death Cap 2nd, 1, if you're snowballing, and 2, if you have existing AP bonuses to amp off it. So because Death Cap is a AP amplifier, it's really good with High Stack Dark Seal. It's good with Gathering Storm, Absolute Focus, Conqueror, Eyeball Collection, Infernal Dragon. All these things that give additional AP can increase the value of Death Cap 2nd. And again, you kind of have to be ahead to get those in the first place, plus the build path. So generally, pretty unrealistic to go Death Cap 2nd, but it's not impossible. And sometimes you might want to go Death Cap 2nd. So why would you do that? Well, you might want to go Death Cap 2nd if you're expecting to have to buy Cryptbloom, because what's a better build path? Well, I'll tell you. Let's say that the enemy team has a bunch of squishies, right? But you have a lot of AP on your team, so you know that they're going to build Magic Resist fairly early. So something you could do is instead of going, say, I don't know, Ludens, Horizon, Cryptbloom Death Cap, and delaying Death Cap to 4th item, you might want to go instead, if you're ahead, Ludens, Death Cap, Cryptbloom, because that allows you to get both your Death Cap and your Cryptbloom earlier in the game. You could also do Ludens, Cryptbloom Death Cap. Now that feels a little it feels a little worse, honestly, to buy it, because Cryptbloom is a not as good an item standalone, and also the build path of Cryptbloom is very weak. But a lot of the time that can be better if you're expecting magic resist to come in very early. And if you can kind of anticipate this, like if you're playing triple AP, a lot of the time it is better to go, say, Cryptbloom second and then Deathcap third, rather than delaying Deathcap all the way to fourth, because it can be quite difficult to get to 4 items in solo queue, especially if you can't get any kills, because people have too much magic resist. So the main thing to take away from this is that you always want to opt into, Deathcap and Cryptbloom in your build, basically no matter what. If you need them earlier, you can buy them earlier, and you kind of need to use a little bit of foresight to see if you're going to need them. But generally, if you can get Deathcap third and fourth, it'll be fine. It is a problem if you start to delay it past that, though. So an example I commonly see is people messing up their second item. So let's say it's a game where they really need a Zhonya's, like a Zhonya's second. If you go, say, Luden's Liandry, and then buy Zhonya's instead of Deathcap, the problem you can have is, like, if you need then a Cryptbloom fourth, you potentially delay your Deathcap to fifth, which means you probably just won't even get it, and you're basically just accepting that you're going to do no damage. So that kind of thing there about the Rabadons to Cryptbloom being important, that is the main reason why only our second item and our last item are truly situational. Pretty much everything else is set in stone of, like, that core first item, and then Deathcap and Cryptbloom in whichever order you need them for third and fourth. Next, we'll talk about some of the different build paths, because there are some champs that actually do want to buy a couple items. So an example would be, I'll talk about Cassio, right? So on Cassio, you often want to go Liandry's and Rylai's before you have Deathcap, because the items are so strong, they have so much synergy with Cassio that it is worth delaying Deathcap for. But again, if you expect to have to build Cryptbloom early, then you should actually drop one of these items. So if I'm playing Cassio on a team with a lot of APs, what I actually do is I drop Rylai's. I just get rid of Rylai's and I build it later. And what I instead do is I go, say, Cryptbloom third, Deathcap fourth. Or I even go Deathcap third, Cryptbloom fourth. And that way I don't delay the spike of having percent magic pen to deal with tanks or magic resist users or whatever. And I'm not delaying my Deathcap so long that I'm just, like, never going to do any damage. I already talked about the early Deathcap and Cryptbloom. That was the main things I was going to remind myself about, but I already talked about them. The other thing would be if you have a utility build. So again, if you are playing something like a Galio, or you're playing like a Swain or something, where you're kind of playing a tankier build, the Deathcap is less important because you have less AP to begin with, and because you're applying pressure and you're bringing value in other ways that aren't just having more damage, right? More AP. But in those builds, you still kind of want a Deathcap ultra late game. So, like, if you're playing Swain and your build was something like, I don't know, Liandry, Rylai, Riftmaker, Zhonya, at that point you probably do want a Deathcap, because you still have, you have so much AP at this point that, like, you would just be like doubling or maybe even tripling your damage by buying a Deathcap. Okay, probably not tripling, doubling your damage potentially by buying a Deathcap. So again, don't sleep on Deathcap, but it can be delayed if you're playing some sort of weird off-tank build or some champ that is built more for utility. In general, though, Cryptbloom and Deathcap, third and fourth, is going to be your go-to. Finally, I'm going to go through all the questions I get asked on stream about different items and just explain my thoughts on them. So the first one they get asked all the time is, which chapter item should I buy? And typically it's between, like, should I go Ludens or Seraphs? Or should I go Malignants or Seraphs? Or Blackfire and Seraphs? Or whatever. So generally, I'll talk about Seraphs first. So the thing with Seraphs is bought when you're expecting to take a bit of damage in team fights. Like if you're playing a mage against an assassin or against a Carthus or something and you are expecting to take damage, then the Seraph shield is really, really nice. But if you're playing in a game where you're not expecting to take damage, then you're better off probably playing Ludens or Malignants or Blackfire. Now, there are certain champs that just swear by Seraphs, so like a champ like Ori is a really, really good Seraphs user. You can drop it and just play something like Ludens instead, but generally I think Seraphs is going to be better. The one downside, I guess, of Seraphs is that the build path is a bit weaker, right? Like you have to build a tier. So sometimes if you really want to pressure your early game, you might just want to itemize a bit more aggressively and play for something like a Ludens. But generally, the reasoning I just use is like, am I going to take a lot of damage in fights as a mage, as like a Syndra or Ori or whatever? If yes, then I go Archangels. Otherwise, I will go for one of the other chapter items. So how about the other chapter items? Well, Malignants, first off, is only really used on champs that have super high value on their ultis. So examples can be like Lysandra, Ari, Aurora is a new one, where it's a cheap item, it gives you a lot of ulti CDR, and a lot of these champs just can't play the game without ult. And also, a lot of those champs don't have other good items to use anyway, like they're not really good Seraphs users, so they just go Malignants instead. Ludens is really, really good on any burst champ, like a LeBlanc or something will always go Ludens, they'll never build Seraphs. And they probably won't build Malignants either, so it's basically just the Burst Champ default. Blackfire is an interesting one, because I think Blackfire is a bait. I think there's only 1 or 2 champs that should use Blackfire. So the thing with Blackfire is that design-wise, it's a very good item. Like, this should be a good item on damage over time champs. But there's some problems with it. One is that it just does too little damage. Like, Liandry is a better damage item. Now, you'll probably say, well, okay, we don't buy Blackfire for damage. Like, we're buying it for mana, right? And that's true. But there's a lot of champs that can't fit it into the build. So let's give Cassio as an example. If we're playing Cassio, right, and we kind of already talked about how, well, we need Deathcap and Cryptbloom, like, kind of a, Deathcap 4th at the very latest. And we need, like, our Rylai's as well. It's like, where do we fit this in, right? It's like, okay, is Blackfire better than Seraphs? Well, the answer is no. Second item, is Blackfire more damaged than Liandry? No. Do we need more mana at that point? Also no. And then it's like, okay, well, we could drop Rylai's for it, maybe. Potentially, if you just want more damage, that's a way you could do it. But generally, you're going to want the Rylai's, right? And by that point, we're going to need a Deathcap. And then past that, we're going to need a Cryptbloom. So it's like, when do you buy it other than last item? I think there's lots of champs like Victor that buy Blackfire that honestly just shouldn't. I think they should go Ludens and Seraphs. Hui is another one that I see with Blackfire. Again, just Ludens or Seraphs. Blackfire is super overrated. I think it's only really good on Malzahar or some other champs that just don't have a good item to buy. And it is just as simple as this item probably should deal a lot more damage, but it's generally going to be better to go like either Tier Liandry or Seraphs Liandry, Millions Liandry, or whatever as a dot champ over buying Blackfire. That being said, Blackfire can be a really good item late game, like as a 6th item, because it does have an AP ratio on it, and it amps your AP. So yeah, this can be good as a 6th item, but generally, I think it's kind of a trash first item. Another one I get asked about is double chapter items. So you can go like Tier, Ludens, Seraphs. That's something you can do. The thing I don't like about double chapter items is it really limits that second item slot, right? So we talked up here about how there are all these situational second items. And the problem with going this is it locks you out of any of those situational second items. Because what's going to happen is you go Ludens, you go Seraphs, and then we need Deathcap and Cryptbloom. So if we ever need a defensive item, if we ever need a Liandry's or a Horizon or whatever, that's going to have to wait until our final item because we just can't fit it in the build. So it's like, well, how often or like when should we do this? I guess you can do this if you know you're not going to need a different second item, but also Shadow Flame is like a bad second item. So it could be if you're not solo AP, because if you're solo AP, you would prefer Shadow Flame. So if you're not solo AP and Liandry's is not good because they have no health stackers, and for some reason like your champ doesn't use Horizon, like Orianna is an example of a champ that can't really use Horizon that well, and you also don't need a defensive item. For me, that doesn't come up very often, because at the moment, I think you go Liandry second on a lot of those champs. So for me, I don't build this at all currently. I think it is viable, and if you just don't want to think about your build, it's not too bad. You can just go, again, Ludens, Seraphs, Deathcap every game, and like not worry about it, and it's going to be like, maybe like 85% of the way there. But you are going to miss out if you really need a defensive item, and potentially you can miss out on like other items if you needed like a Cryptbloom earlier than that or something. Another one I get all the time is Void Staff or Cryptbloom. So generally, Cryptbloom is just a better item. The reason is that the ability haste on Cryptbloom and the heal is normally more valuable than having the extra AP and the extra magic pen. That being said, if you're a champ that doesn't really use cooldown reduction, like Akali, it's a really good idea to buy Void Staff, because the ability haste is just not that valuable for you. But if you're not sure, generally just go Cryptbloom. Now again, Void is being buffed next patch. I am still pretty sure that Cryptbloom is going to be better. I think the 15 ability haste goes a really long way, depending on the champ, and also the heal. As you get later in the game, the heal can actually be more valuable, right? The heal has an AP ratio on it, especially if you're buying it off the death cap, that can make the heal even stronger. So TLDR, Void Staff on champs that don't use ability haste, Cryptbloom on ones that do, which is basically all of them. A couple other things I want to talk about. Roa. So a lot of people ask me about Rod of Ages. I'm a Rod of Ages hater. The reason is that Rod of Ages is a neutralizer and it delays your build. So the thing is that like there are some champs that need to neutralize early. So like if you're playing like a Nivea into a really hard matchup, or like again Cassio into a really hard matchup, you need a Roa because you can't survive without it, right? Catalyst is a great item for helping you not lose lane. That being said, it doesn't really help you win lane either. So like when I play Cassio, for example, I only play Cassio into matchups that I win because I don't want to buy a Roa. And the reason I mainly don't like Roa is, again, because it locks you out of a lot of these other items. Like, let's come back to this Cassio build. If we go Roa Seraphs, it's like, okay, well, we can go Leandri Deathcap, but then we have to drop Riley's completely. Or we might just want to go like Roa Seraph's Deathcap, you know, and not delay our Deathcap super long. So basically, there's two reasons I don't like Roa. One is that it takes up a very valuable item slot. It basically means that we can't build other situational items. And two, I think generally it is better to build the snowball instead of to neutralize. But again, if you're in a difficult matchup, if you're against something that needs to snowball, like an assassin, sometimes neutralizing can be very good, right? So it's something worth thinking about, but generally I don't buy that often. A lot of people ask me on stream if they should upgrade to Mejais or not, and the answer is normally no. So the thing with upgrading Darksteel to Mejais is Mejais are also super efficient, but Mejais have a huge risk with them, right? If you buy Mejais and you lose the stacks, it's very, very bad. But you can upgrade to Mejais if you're really certain you won't die. So if you're playing a champ that's very safe, or they have very low threat, or you're really strong or whatever, then you can buy Mejais. I often buy Mejais on champs like Ari or LeBlanc because they have a lot of safety, but I would never buy Mejais against, you know, comps that can kill you very easily. Like if you're playing against something like Vi and Rel, there's a good chance that at some point you randomly die to like their flash engages, right? And that's not really that realistic to play around. Like, yes, you might be able to minimize it. Maybe you can avoid deaths most of the time, but if you die once or twice, suddenly your Mejais is in a really, really bad spot. So basically, you should upgrade to Mejais if you can get away with it, but be very careful. I think a lot of the time it is not worth upgrading to Mejais, and just sitting on the Darksteel is often better. Healing cut is something that needs to be talked about. So in my opinion, anti-heal is a fake stat. I think it's really useless. So the thing is that first off, by buying healing reduction, you are giving up gold, right? In terms of other stats. Now 30 AP is not bad, right? But remember that Oblivion Orb is delaying your death cap or whatever, your Cryptbloom, by 800 gold, which, you know, that's a significant amount of time. It could mean that you get death cap a fight later, right? And 30 AP is definitely not as much as you would get from getting that death cap 800 gold earlier, right? So the thing is, like, even though heal cut can be good, sometimes it does mean you deal less damage. And a lot of the time, you would actually deal more effective damage just by not buying healing cut. Also, there are a lot of champs that you would think you would buy healing cut against that actually just kind of don't care. So like an example would be Soraka. I used to be a always buy heal cut versus Soraka champ, or a person. And what would happen is that Soraka would just, I would poke them, they would walk away, and then she would heal her team to full, and then she would come back. So I often found that Grievous Wounds just didn't actually apply at useful times. Now, I'm not saying don't ever buy Grievous Wounds, but I think have like a higher, what's the word? Like a higher threshold to buying Grievous Wounds than you had previously. You really need to see multiple healing champs, and especially ones that are going to heal specifically in combat and don't really have a way of dropping it. Also, it's very important that if you're buying this, you're a champ with either a dot, so you can lengthen the duration, or with a ton of AoE, so you can apply it to multiple targets. Buying this on a champ like LeBlanc, extremely useless, but buying it on AoE champs like Brand can be kind of useful. As for Morello, like, is upgrading to Morello worth it? Like, yes and no. So the thing is, Morello, like, has pretty good stats for its cost, right? You look at that and, like, 90 AP, 15 ability haste for only 2200 gold. That's actually not bad. But the thing is, like, if you want to spend gold on the most efficient stats, you should actually just be buying Death Cap most of the time. So generally, you don't upgrade Oblivion Orbs to Morello unless it's, like, 6 items and you need Healing Cut and, like, you just want to upgrade it to finish your build. But normally, you don't upgrade to Morello. At least, I'm not a huge fan. And the final thing that I have to talk about to close up this guide is, what do you do ultra late game if you have so much gold that you can sell your boots and buy another item? So if you get to true 6 items, normally what you do is you sell boots for a movement speed item. So the 3 items you can buy are, you can buy Lichbane, because Lichbane gives 8% move speed, so you would sell boots and buy that. You can also buy Cosmic. Cosmic only gives 5%, but it gives a damage proc. Now this is bugged in the description, but it does give you, it gives you movement speed when you hit someone with an ability, which is really, really nice. So you could go Cosmic instead of Lichbane. You can also buy Storm Surge. This is about the only acceptable time you can buy Storm Surge, because 8% movement speed is kind of a lot. So that's like a decent late game item as well. You can also buy Mejais. If you have like high stacks on your Darksteel and you're trying to finish up your build, then upgrading to Mejais for the movement speed and, you know, getting rid of boots and buying another item, then that can be quite good too. Now, it is worth buying or selling boots for 1 movement speed item, but it's ideal if you can have 2. So like ultra late game, You know, if you can have, say, Lichbane and Cosmic over something like a Shadow Flame, that can be better. So if you get to like true best, like if you have literal full build, you know, items like Shadow Flame that give flat pen are not very useful in late game. So you could probably sell that and then go for 2 movement speed items, like a Lichbane and a Cosmic. But how often do games get to this literal full build? Not very often, but that is how you itemize if you get ultra late game and you have that many items. So I think that's literally everything I can think of covered. If you guys still have questions after all that, put them in the comment section below or come to my stream at twitch.tv/ShokLol and I will be happy to answer all your questions. But yeah, if you did like this, go ahead and like, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.